video, which is part of the greater Project Revolution, we're going to be talking about the Mexican War of Independence in the early 19th century. However, before we start talking about the Mexican War of Independence, or more accurately the Wars of Independence, we have to understand the social, political, economical, and religious aspects that drove the Mexican ideas of revolution in the first place, and for that we'll have to look at the Viceroyalty of New Spain, also known as the Colony of New Spain. This colony was governed in all administrative aspects by the viceroy, who was appointed by the Spanish monarch. The viceroy was supposed to govern a colony which at its largest extent included southern Canada, Venezuela, the Philippines, Florida, etc. The pure scale of this colony meant that the viceroy couldn't really govern the entire viceroyalty effectively, and therefore most of the administrative and judicial matters fell to the local governmental bodies, the largest of which were the audiencias. There's way more political organization in New Spain than we have time to get into, but some important things of note are that the audiencias had to not only answer directly to the viceroy but also council and ministry of the Indies. However, this was only in administrative matters, not judicial ones. Plus, the audiencias weren't even the only governmental body, as there were smaller ones called cabildo, tendencias, capitancias general, etc. Lastly, what is important to understand is that even though this was the Viceroyalty of New Spain at its largest extent, the borders often changed and the viceroy control in some border regions was purely superficial. This vast colony was governed from the former Aztec capital Tenochtitlan, now renamed Mexico City. Mexico City was not only the administrative heartland of New Spain, but also the economical and social one. It was the largest city in the Western Hemisphere in the 18th century and was connected from the Pacific by the port of Acapulco and the Caribbean by the port of Veracruz. This trade network going across the heartland of Mexico created drastic economic development within the area, which resulted in the fact that by the 18th century, the lands between Veracruz, Mexico City, and Acapulco had over half of the entire population of New Spain. However, this population of New Spain was very heavily divided into a caste system. This system assigned social, economic, administrative, and other privileges to people depending on their racial background. Now, this system in its purest form was very simple, but in practice it was anything but simple. It also changed drastically since the foundation of New Spain in 1521 until the early 19th century. With that said, I'm going to be presenting the caste system as it existed in the late 18th century. So the simple system went like this. On top were the Peninsulares, people born in Spain or elsewhere in Europe. This group had the largest social and economic benefits, and almost all high-ranking administrative and governmental jobs in the colony could be held by only them. Under Peninsulares were the Criollos, which were people born to both Spanish or European parents in the Americas. Criollos mostly had the same benefits as Peninsulares, with the exception that they could only be appointed to lower level governmental jobs. Under the Criollos were mostly two classes, the Indios or Amerindians and the Mestizos. The Indios were people purely descended from the native Indian population, and in fact some Amerindian communities were very strict in the notion of pure blood Indios. It is very hard to classify this group because their social status was very heavily dependent on the family's background. For example, the Aztec nobility that existed prior to the Spanish colonization got pretty much assimilated into the Spanish nobility. On top of that, some Indios people became very wealthy through mine or farm ownership, and those people enjoyed a very high standard within the society. With that said, most of the Indios people in Mexico were poor peasants that were not allowed to hold any administrative jobs other than in specifically defined Amerindian communities. The Mestizos were people descended from one Indios parent and one Spanish/European parent. In the early colonial era, this term was associated with being a bastard, as Mestizos were oftentimes born out of wedlock. However, in the late 18th century, the term started to be much more widespread and started to encompass more racial subdivisions than just purely having one Indios and one European parent. By the 19th century, the word mestizo started to be used to describe any kind of mixed-race person. Mestizos as Indios are hard to classify, as depending on their wealth, family history, and sometimes just purely skin color, they could have benefits as high as of a criollo. Under Indios and Mestizos were mulattoes, which were people of European and African descent, and later also included people of Amerindian and African descent. These people were at the low end of the caste system, not having any real benefits, and if their mom was a slave, they could also end up being slaves. Lastly were the Negros, people of pure African descent. These people were mostly slaves or descended of slaves brought to New Spain mainly during the 17th century, when Spain ruled over Portugal and its vast Portuguese slave trade. However, it is important to note that even though legal by the late 18th century, slave ownership was almost non-existent, and the population of Africans in mainland of New Spain was no more than 0.2%. This was mostly because by the end of the 18th century there was an abundance of cheap labor, mainly from the growing mestizo class. This combined with the fact that mainland New Spain had mostly higher profit margin jobs like the textile industry, the dye industry, mining, etc. meant that slavery was largely obsolete. The last important driving force in New Spain was Catholicism. The Spanish Inquisition was in full force back in Europe, and that mentality got very much transferred over into New Spain, creating what we now call the Mexican Inquisition. The Mexican Inquisition was focused heavily on converting the larger native population into Catholicism. The Amerindians prior to the Spanish arrival had religion at the center of their society, and with their conversion to Catholicism, this did not change. Even though in many areas this conversion was forceful, once converted, the native population became devout Catholics that brought in many aspects from their old religion. There's no better example of this than the apparition of the Virgin Mary to an Indios farmer in the 16th century, now known as Our Lady of Guadalupe. The Lady of Guadalupe would later become a symbol for the mestizo and Amerindian parts of the revolution. This newfound avid devotion to Catholicism by the native population, combined with the already existing avid devotion to Catholicism of the Spanish, meant that the Catholic Church had almost just the same amount of power in New Spain as the Spanish monarchy. These three pillars of New Spain, governance, religion, and caste system, were the major forces behind the way the Mexican War of Independence started and finished. It all began during the Bourbon reform of the 18th century, when the new Bourbon dynasty in Spain hoped to reform their overseas territories to bring in new prosperity to their country. These reforms were focused on centralizing the administration of the colonies, reaffirming more direct Spanish control over the colonies, and diminishing the power of the church. However, what the reforms ended up doing was giving even more power to the Peninsulares, making the Criollos and Mestizos unhappy, and also making enemies with the church, which would later on make it more sympathetic towards the Mexicans during their strive for independence. As animosity against Spain grew in all social classes except the Peninsulares, the ideas of a revolution became more and more prominent within the Mexican people. All it needed now was a spark to light the fire, and the spark came in the form of an averagely tall Frenchman called Napoleon. Napoleon's Peninsular War, which started in 1807, was very messy, and after the 1808 forced abdication of the Spanish monarch, destroyed any Spanish control in the New World. Almost immediately after the abdication, multiple juntas were created throughout Spain, each claiming to be the legitimate representation of the Spanish government and its king. These juntas then sent out representatives to the Spanish colonies asking to be officially recognized by them. After receiving two representatives from two different Spanish juntas, the current viceroy of New Spain, José de Iturricaray, was very confused. Nonetheless, this arrival of multiple representatives proved to everyone that Spain had no real control over New Spain anymore, and so the debate about what to do next started. The Criollo party, which controlled the Mexico City Council, voted for self-governance, with the current viceroy at its head. Iturricaray agreed, as he was mostly a Criollo sympathizer and also would get to rule New Spain. However, the Peninsulares who controlled the Audiencias vetoed this idea, arguing that New Spain was a colony and therefore did not have the right to self-govern without Spain. The Peninsulares started to fear that their control of New Spain was fading in favor of the Criollos, and therefore created a coup against Iturricaray, arresting him on some dubious charges and quickly appointing one of their own as a new viceroy. For the next year, Pedro de Jaribay acted as the viceroy of the colony for all intensive purposes, as if nothing was happening in Spain. After a year, he recognized the Spanish junta of Aranjuez, who mostly managed to centralize their power within Spain, and then he decided to retire, as he may have thought things bigger than him were brewing across the colony. He appointed Francisco Javier as his successor, but this guy also lasted only a year after being replaced by the Junta of Aranjuez. The new viceroy, Francisco Javier Venegas, was sent from Spain to quell now the extremely unhappy population of New Spain. This is because ever since the coup by the Peninsulares against Iturrijara, most Mexicans felt like they were forcefully controlled by the unlawful government in Mexico City, which seldomly cared for the people of New Spain. And this idea was the battle cry for the first Mexican independence movement that started just 2 days after Venegas took office. Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla was the leader of this movement, starting in the town of Dolores. The Revolutionary Army was small at first, numbering only around 600 men, but the next few days they traveled across the Mexican countryside, killing any Peninsulares they came across and gaining much needed support, equipment, and manpower. They also adopted the standard of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which would draw in much needed mestizo and Indio support for the revolution. By the time the viceroy was able to muster up some sort of an army for defense, Hidalgo had around 100,000 men at his disposal. Hidalgo met the much smaller New Spain's army at the Battle of Monte de las Cruces, where they scored a decisive victory. Now with Mexico City within their sight, Hidalgo made a decision that has puzzled historians to this day. He decided not to besiege Mexico City and instead marched north towards the second most important city in Mexico, Guadalajara. Many of his troops disagreed with this choice and started to desert en masse. Once he arrived to Guadalajara, his army numbered only around 6,000 men. Nonetheless, he managed to take the city and gain support from the city's lower class and the surrounding countryside. By the time the new viceroyal army arrived to Guadalajara, Hidalgo had again around 80 to 100,000 men. However, the army was ill-equipped and therefore was decisively defeated at the Battle of Calderon Bridge. After this defeat, the revolutionaries tried to flee towards the US, but were later captured and executed along with Hidalgo, and with that, the Hidalgo's independence movement was over. However, the revolution itself was far from over. The peninsular abuse, along with Hidalgo's show that the Spanish could be defeated, meant that many new insurgencies spurred up all around New Spain. Ignacio Lopez Rayon in the center of the country, Father Jose Maria Morelos in the south, and various other groups all around the colony. But all these groups weren't united in their pursuit for freedom. Some wanted the status quo unchanged, other than having Mexico not be under Spanish control anymore, and others wanted a full change of the Mexican hierarchy, administrative system, policies, and religion. Therefore, it is unsurprising that due to such disunity and difference of ideas, the Mexican Revolution continued in a stalemate until 1820. But what actually happened then? Well, in 1820, after a decade of fighting, the various Mexican insurgencies were on the brink of collapse, mostly due to the now apathetic stance of the Mexican people, which were sick of fighting at this point. But in comes Agustín Cosme Damián de Iturbide y Aramburu, a Mexican nobleman who in 1820 was a royalist, a colonel, and a general of south of New Spain. However, despite his current status, Iturbide was a complicated man. He was always a conservative, sympathetic to the royalists, but he was also a criollo, meaning that throughout his life and military career, he faced setbacks due to the New Spain's caste system. He was also asked by Hidalgo in the first wave of the revolution to be a commander in his army. Iturbide, however, declined, later joining the royalists and fighting many of the insurgencies of the 1810s. From the victories he gained during this time, Iturbide garnered much prestige and support of the more conservative Mexicans. But by 1820, even Iturbide started to be fed up with the entire war and the peninsular control of the government. Plus, being a conservative and a royalist, when Iturbide learned of a successful liberal revolution in Spain which established a constitutional monarchy, he, just as many other conservative Mexicans, was afraid of what liberal changes that would bring to a monarchy-centric New Spain. So when Iturbide was sent on what was supposed to be the last royalist campaign against the wavering revolutionaries, instead of fighting them, he attended a meeting with the insurgency leader Vicente Guerrero. It was even at this first meeting that signs of problems started to appear. Iturbide, representing the Mexican conservative values, wanted a monarchy with the aristocracy on top, an independent Mexican monarchy, but a monarchy nonetheless. The revolutionaries, on the other hand, were mostly Republicans, hoping to establish a USA-like republic. This divide was eventually settled by the three guarantees. First, the newly independent Mexico will become a monarchy under a Spanish or any other European monarch that is willing to take the throne, but it will be a constitutional monarchy decided upon to appease the liberals. Second, the aristocracy would still exist under the Mexican monarchy, but the caste system would be abolished, with all Mexican people counted as equals. Lastly, to appease the conservatives and the church, the Catholic religion would become the official and only religion of the new Mexican empire. With this agreement, which guaranteed the status quo to be mostly unchanged for the higher class and equality with representation in the constitutional monarchy for the lower class, for the first time in the Mexican Revolution, most of the people were behind the same cause. So the revolutionary armies and the royalist armies under Iturbide combined, forming the Army of the Three Guarantees. This army then marched towards Mexico City, where it was greeted by a joyous populace shouting "Viva Iturbide!" Seeing the wide-ranging support for the Three Guarantees, the viceroy, along with the few remaining people still loyal to Spain, escaped, and with that the Empire of Mexico was proclaimed in 1821. Iturbide managed to achieve what 11 years of senseless fighting didn't. By compromising, he managed to bring together two main opposing factions and oust the Spanish. He was hailed all around Mexico and was given the leadership role of the regency, while a suitable Spanish or European noble was searched for. However, no European noble wanted to take the spot of Emperor of Mexico. Wait, what? No one? Why? Sounds like a great job. I would take it. Well, this is because back in Spain, the victorious liberals managed to become the defeated liberals, with the Spanish monarch regaining control. He then set out to campaign against any other European noble taking the Mexican throne, and even had plans of invading Mexico himself. The Mexican regency had no choice but to appoint a Mexican noble on the throne, and no Mexican noble was as famous or as well regarded as Iturbide. So in 1822, allegedly against his wishes, Iturbide was crowned as Emperor Agustin I of Mexico. Iturbide, however, was facing problems right from the get-go. For example, the conservative-leaning areas in Mexico still abided by the now technically abolished caste system, and the proclaimed equality of the Three Guarantees wasn't really much existent. Iturbide tried doing something against this, but that only lost him support with the hardline conservatives, which wanted the caste system. On top of that, he also lost support with the royalists, as they wanted a normal monarchy, not a constitutional one, and also wanted a European monarch, not a Mexican one. On the other side of the political spectrum, Iturbide was hated by the Republicans for, well, existing, as they wanted a republic, not a monarchy. Plus, they thought he wasn't doing enough to enforce the abolition of the caste system. To add to all these problems, Iturbide, even though a skilled general, proved not to be a skilled administrator or a politician. Due to all this, just a year later in 1823, the Republicans managed to gain control, and the sad and demoralized Iturbide abdicated, after which he was exiled by the Republicans. When Iturbide was leaving the country, it was still very clear that even though the far right and the far left hated him, he was still loved by the majority of the country. People gathered around his coach as he was leaving and even insisted on pushing it themselves instead of the horses. When he came to the coast, he left for Italy. During his exile, the situation in Mexico worsened. The conservatives and royalists were in an uproar as the Republicans were in control. The Republicans themselves were divided, unable to create a cohesive governmental body that would succeed the empire, and the southern states of Mexico proclaimed independence, creating the United Provinces of Central America. On top of all this, the lower classes and the far-right liberals, which up until now were mostly controlled by the higher classes, which were mostly wealthy conservative Peninsulares, started to actively berate and attack them. This meant that many wealthy Peninsulares and even some criollos started to leave for Europe, taking their wealth with them. This wealth drain would continue for most of the 19th century, and arguably Mexico would never recover from it. In all this chaos, the royalists convinced Iturbide to return to Mexico and restore order. He did in 1824, but the wavering royalist party, along with many of the people that would support him now leaving to Europe, meant that he wasn't able to garner much political support and power. Nonetheless, he was still loved by the majority of the people, and the Republicans, basically in a panic, fearing an Iturbide takeover, ordered his execution. Iturbide, probably sick of fighting and not wanting to cause another war which would destroy Mexico even more, surrendered peacefully. Many people called him incompetent, corrupt, dictatorial, etc. And even though those words usually were well-founded, he always tried putting Mexico first, for better or for worse. His last words before a firing squad were, "Mexicans, in the very act of my death, I recommend to you the love to the fatherland and the observance to our religion, for it shall lead you to glory. I die having come here to help you, and I die merrily, for I die amongst you. I die with honor, not as a traitor. I do not leave this stain on my children and my legacy. I'm not a traitor. No." Even after his death, he was admired and respected by most Mexicans, and his life and demise represented perfectly the dichotomy of Mexican politics for the next 100 years, with Mexico and its people going back and forth between dictators and monarchies and republics. That is where I will end this video, as it is already very long. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're enjoying the whole Project Revolution. It was a blast to make and work with all these history YouTubers. If you want to continue to the next video in the collab, let me point you towards House of History video about the Boxer Rebellion, and the video prior to mine in the collab is by Useful Charts about the monarchies involved in the French Revolution. My name is Mlazer, and if you liked my video, subscribe and stick around for history.